First of all, I want to thank John, Francis Leader, for giving us this valuable time to answer some of our questions about stress and how it affects us in the workplace. First question I have to ask is about your own business. Do you come across many stress-related problems in your practice?
Yes, increasingly so. I don't really think that's because there's more stress in the world, although it may seem that way. But when people come, there's two things that we'll often look at. One is what the presenting problem is, which is the specific issue or difficulty that a person wants to work on. And that can be a person individually, or it can be an organisation, a group of people working together, a community. And the presenting problem very often is stress. People will come and say, I'm stressed, I need to work on that, or workplace stress is an issue. But even if that's not the specific thing that they focus on, stress is inevitably always a factor in whatever the problem is, because stress in and of itself is usually about something. Something's causing the stress, it's in relation to something. So sometimes people will come with a particular area and that's what they want to focus on, but stress then is just an important element within that. So yes would definitely be the answer. It's something that we work with hugely and extensively.
Okay, could you give a few examples of how stress may affect the workplace? Okay, it may not be caused by the actual work itself, or it may well do.
Sure.
And I'm not just talking about the ordinary workers, I'm talking about even up to top level management.
Sure.
Maybe something you came across.
Yeah, well, there are two main things within stress when you're working with it, which is a nice way of breaking it down and thinking about it, which we call triggers and thresholds. And what the trigger is the specific thing that tends to cause the stress. It's normally the thing that a person can notice. And that can be literally just about anything. So in a workplace environment, there's so many different things that could be causing that. The threshold then is the ability of a person to, once they're triggered, be able to handle and cope with the stress that's in the system. So ideally, we'd have very, very few triggers and a very high threshold. And what you've got in the middle is the range.
Right.
That's, if you want to do hostage negotiation or whatever, you can go right up the list, have a very high threshold, because you will be triggered by that type of thing.
Right.
And some people have very low thresholds and very low triggers, so they do okay. And then some people have very high thresholds and high triggers. They kind of do okay if there's enough clearance there too, but that space in the middle is really what it's all about. So in a workplace setting, the types of examples of what can be triggers, the big thing with stress is really conflict. When two things aren't working or where they're not aligned, that's really the thing. And kind of interesting if you think about stress, if you think about it from an engineering point of view, mechanically, if you think about metal, now what causes stress or strain on metals is usually when a device, it's rubbing too much, it's not working in the way it's designed to. And it's very much the same thing in a workplace. So from, you're talking about senior management, right down to people who've just started a new job and everybody in between. The interesting thing is the ability for any of those people to be stressed doesn't tend to vary that much depending on the level of their position. You may have somebody in senior management who, of course, on one hand has a huge amount more responsibility. It weighs down on their shoulders, but at the same time they may also have the power to be able to be consistent with that and to solve problems as they arise. And it's not so much how much is on your shoulders that equals stress, but also your ability to be able to cope with and work with that. You may have then somebody who's in a junior position who has less responsibility, maybe technically, but maybe they don't have the authority to get the job done, and things like that are often what cause stress.
Or they think that they don't have the authority.
Absolutely.
They do.
And that communication point is such an important part of it, because really when we're ever working with stress, we're always working with predominantly perception, and perception is the key thing. I mean, of course, there are practical things that need to be changed if the hours of a person's job are particularly stressful, needlessly so. Somebody has to come in very early or stay late, and that's not necessary to the role. That's an objective, practical thing that needs to be changed. But that may be difficult to change, but what can usually be changed fairly readily is the way things are perceived, and communication, as you say, is a big part of that.
So, very interesting points that I want to discuss a little later. Would you see stress as something that can be managed, in the sense that there could be simple techniques that we can employ? And this can again go on to all workers, because it's in no one's interest that stress is in the workplace.
Sure. That's an important point. It is in nobody's interest, and sometimes when people think of stress management, immediately people think, well, what does that cost? From an employer's point of view, and really what it costs not to do it is usually a lot more than what it costs to address it. And an interesting thing as well with stress management is even if an employer or a company is trying to do something about it, that alone can actually do so much. Because if somebody detects as an employee or as a staff member that their employer cares, very often that can relieve a lot of stress, just that feeling that support's there. So there are very real and practical things that can be done, but I'd say the first thing to do is to do something, anything at all, even an effort to face it, to address it, to monitor it, to understand it, is a very healthy thing in its own right. There's an interesting effect called a Hawthorne effect in psychology, whereby they were bringing in researchers to study the workplace to try and monitor productivity. And they found that when the researchers were there, productivity increased. Just the act of having people there monitoring it actually created a positive effect. Because the act of doing something can be very effective in itself. Now within that, of course, you can go a lot further. You can make practical arrangements to make sure that there is good communication in place between co-workers so misunderstandings aren't arising in the first place. That can be very useful. Clearly defined roles also help a lot too. Now it doesn't need to be, nitpicking in detail. I think everybody understands that in some roles there is a need for flexibility. But if even the flexibility is written into it, and there's a sense of understanding and a person is appreciated for what they're doing, that can be very effective as well. And in physical stress, there's a huge amount that can be done. Even simple things like breathing techniques, just to be able to relax and to manage the levels of stress. Taking breaks, but not even just taking breaks where somebody sits around thinking about what's stressing them, because that's not necessarily going to do it, but taking time to get some fresh air, particularly in winter time as well. Light is a very, very important thing. Seasonal affective disorder happens when the light levels grow low in winter, and often people's moods are lowering, so therefore the threshold is going lower, so they may be triggered more easily than they may be in summer, for example. So there are practical things like that that can be done, and I would certainly highly recommend.
Well, yeah, I asked earlier about top-level management, and you mentioned that they themselves experience stress.
Sure.
But of course, they're empowered to deal with it not only for themselves but for others as well.
Yeah.
And would you have any advice to, if I was a manager and I see it, I agree with you, it's an issue.
Yeah.
What can I do about it?
Well, a huge thing to do is, as we said, doing something at all. Because if a person themselves is noticing it, they can use that experience and to make sure that it doesn't keep going. It doesn't need to pass. The buck stops here. That old expression is really what being in charge, being in leadership is all about, making sure it doesn't need to pass any further and getting their own assistance. And the expression is it's lonely at the top, and that sometimes happens. Stress can build up simply because there's a need to put on a face, to seem in control. In a big company where the shareholders, arguably the person in charge, isn't even in charge, there's a sense of them being an employee too, and needing to give the appearance that things are going a certain way. And there's a bit of room, I think, for vulnerability in this as well, and even honesty. Sometimes working with staff and saying, listen, I'm under a lot of pressure here, I don't know if you guys have any ideas. It's giving a bit of credit where it's due and actually sharing it and working on it together. So there are some ideas that I've seen working, but of course in every different circumstance there are different solutions that are suitable, but that desire to want to address it and face it is a really key thing.
There's one scenario that keeps popping up in my research for this stress, and it's the lack of competency.
Right.
Some boss, they want the job done,
sure,
but they haven't taken the time to make sure the person who's doing the job is given enough empowerment or training or whatever way you want to put it to do the job, and then of course that leads to stress levels that are maybe disproportionate. So would you stress that to the people who come, managers, that stress can be avoided for a large part, and it's just if the right people are in the right jobs being looked after?
Yes. Well, using that mechanical example of metals and strain like an engine working together, There are different things that you can utilise. Oil and lubrication, I suppose, is a way of understanding that there will be friction whenever people are getting together doing things.
Yeah, sure.
And that's okay, and it's kind of inevitable. And not to be too concerned about that, but to be taking steps to minimise it, to make sure that, you know, if there is a little bit of friction, that it's counterbalanced, I suppose, by some pleasant words and things like that. But the thing of competency, or the issue with that, is that ultimately it's not, I suppose, that somebody's competent or not competent for a given role. There are degrees of competency. And to the degree that you have a match, the right person in the right job, working with the right co-workers, with the right mission in mind, that's the degree to which stress is going to be avoided and is going to be averted. And it takes work, there's no doubt about it, and I will never lie to somebody who's coming and asking, particularly in management, you know, how do we fix this or how do we make it work? It requires the culture, the ethos of the business or the organisation to really include that. And it's no question that for a mechanic, for example, to just put any part in an engine would be quicker and easier. But it's going to wear harder. It's going to need to be replaced quicker. And as a result, it can actually end up costing an awful lot of money, as well as stress for the people involved. So what I would say is that having the ethos of the organisation to be one of working together well is actually a very smart financial decision, as well as just a nice thing to do for your co-workers and for your own quality of life. And particularly at the moment, with economies and budgets, people say, can we afford, you know, to improve the quality of life of our workers? And I'd argue you can not afford to not do it, because people have more pressures outside of work as well as within work. That can lower productivity. And productivity being lowered can lower really the amount of customers coming on board and the way the business works. So it is really, really important.
Well, there you have it. Stress management is good management. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.